What are the different ways that police departments can use to rank you as a candidate? Let's discuss. Hey, before we get started, I have two gifts in the description for you. One is the Getting Started Workshop. It's going to walk you through every phase of the hiring process. There's some hidden bonuses in there for you as well. Next is a coaching call with any member of my team or even myself if you like, where we can sit down, go over your hiring process, your success in your police career. Now, the different ways that a department can rank a candidate going through the hiring process. And there's a couple different processes that departments can use. Not every department will rank a candidate the same way, so we'll try to cover a couple of them here, and I'm sure there's some out there that departments use that I'm not even knowledgeable about. But the ones that I do know about, we'll discuss them right now. Let's start off at first with the overall ranking. Now, I don't actually see this one as much, but I do see it in a lot of civil service type hiring processes and even sometimes even larger cities or hiring pool departments. And some of these are kind of hybrid as well. So the first one is the overall ranking structure. What it is all of your scores for everything that you do are compiled and moved forward all the way up until you get to pretty much the background stage where you get to the pass and fail aspect of it. Now, everything you do has a pass and fail component, but there's certain ranking structures that you'll be put in to determine whether or not who moves forward. And how does this work? You can have, say you have a traditional hiring process, right? Not a department that has, goes out of order or maybe doesn't have all the traditional steps. And you start with your written exam. So you'll get your scores of your written exam. And then you pass your scores you pass your written exam and you move forward, and that score carries over with you. And then you do your physical exam. And then that score is compiled with your written exam score to give you a overall score. And then you go over to your board interview. And then that score right there is also compiled with all your other scores. And that gives them the initial group that they would want to make conditional offers to, if they even do conditional offers. And what that is that group is put in a hierarchy from top to bottom. And that is the process in which they move candidates along to, say, your backgrounds or your polys and your medical and your psych, your chief's interview, all the way up to your final offer, right? And you start the academy, or you get selected for a pre-hire. That is a very total aspect. Now, once again, I see this in ranking systems for sometimes larger departments. Any department can use this, but I see it a lot more in larger departments and a lot more in civil service style department hiring processes. What I typically tend to see on the other side of this is something a little bit different, which is a single stage move forward. So the single stage looks like this. You go in, you take your written exam, you pass, right? At that point in time, they take all the individuals that took their written exam that scored high enough, or they were above a certain threshold, or caps out the top highest that passed to whatever number they want to invite to the PT test. So you score really well on that. Well, then when you go to your PT test, your written exam scores don't matter at all. At all. What they're going to do is they're going to take the next highest group of individuals that pass their PT test, because what they're looking for is they already know you can pass your written exam. Now they want to see if they can get individuals at the next highest level, right? So that would be their PT. So then you do your PT exam and you pass your PT exam and they dwindle it down. So, and the reason that a lot of departments will do this is because you might still have a lot of applicants. Let's say you have a mid-size agency, an agency under 100 sworn officers, right? Between 50 and 100 sworn officers. Well, let's say they're really hurting for candidates. And so what's hurting for them? Let's say they're 25% understaffed, so they need to hire 25, right? Let's say that they're listed at 100 sworn officers and they're 25% understaffed and they need to hire 25 officers. Well, you might get 400 to 1,000 applicants, but let's say you get 400 applicants that go through. Out of that 400 right there, you're going to get 300 that pass the written exam, right? So you get 300 that pass the written exam. That's going to be really hard to test 300 individuals in a PT exam, especially for a mid-size agency about that size, because that's a lot of testing. You can maybe bring out, a couple groups of 30 each weekend, or for a month. You can kind of get through a couple different individuals and try to test out 100 of those individuals, right, to get to 25. So you test out of the 300 that pass the written exam, you take your top 100 of those that pass the written exam, and you invite them to the PT test. And then out of those that pass the PT test, you take your top 50 that pass your PT test, and say you're going to interview them. Now that's a lot of people to interview for a billet of 25, right? It might not even be 50. It could be, if you have 25 billets that you can fill in the academy on the next cycle and the next academy, maybe you'll actually bring over the next 40, right? Because you're giving a chance for individuals to fail or rank in that structure. But let's say it's the 50. So you started with 400, 300 passed the written exam. Out of that 300, you don't want to test 300, so you test the top 100. Out of those top 100, let's say 75 pass and 25 fail. So now you have 75 applicants that you can bring into the board interview. And then from the board interview, you can dwindle it down and decide how many you want to move forward. And we want to move a couple more forward just in case individuals fail poly or psych or background, right? So you take that and you have, your 75 that passed your PT, or your top 75 in your PT, right? 300 go over, you test 100. Out of that, you have 75 pass. Well, now we're going to interview, let's say we're going to interview 50. So out of that 50, 45, we'll say less than that. So out of that 50, we'll say 40 actually pass, which means get high enough marks. But we're going to re-rank, not with any of the other stuff. We're just going to rank based off of how you did on that board interview, because we know you already meet the standards for the other two components. So you have that 40 that pass. Well, to interview 40 for 25 positions, that's not too bad, right? You could do that, but that's a lot of interviews, especially for a smaller department or a 100 sworn officer department. So you have 40 interviews. Let's say we need 25 billets. We're going to interview 35. Well, if you're not in the top 35 from your PT test, right, then you're no good. So 75 pass, but we're only going to interview the top 35, or we're going to start with the top 35. Now, we may keep the others in limbo, so to say, and I don't necessarily agree with that, right? And just say, hey, currently you're not among. I wish they would actually put out a scale as to where you are, so you can choose to stay with that department's hiring process or pursue another department. But we don't really advertise that, or a department doesn't really advertise that. In that, they will go through and they'll pick their top 35 or they'll pick their top 35 out of the interview. So they'll interview 40, 45, and let's say they pick their top 35 that interviewed the best, and that's a whole new cycle that they're measuring off of. They're not taking any of your previous scores into account, and they just go off of that and they move you forward based on that. So they have a couple in retainer, plus they have a significant amount of in retainer from the PT exam. And then a lot of times a department won't even tell you, even if you haven't been moved forward in the process, because they're keeping those individuals in retainer a lot, they won't even tell you you haven't been selected until those billets have been filled and hired. So say it's a 4 to 6 month hiring process. Let's say it's a 6 month hiring process. You go 3 months in or 2 months in to getting all the way up to the board interviews, and you haven't got a board interview invite, or maybe you did, right? Maybe you were the 75 that got invited to the board interview, or the 75 that were slated past the PT test, and you go in and you say, hey, you passed your PT test, stand by. Well, they might run another cycle of board interviews if they get too many candidates into the hiring process that fail the background, fail the psych, and that's why they usually start a hiring process so early, to give themselves a little bit of time to play catch up in case all their applicants don't make it through. But they already give themselves a cushion. If they have 25 applicants that are that they need to put through the academy, they're going to push 35 or maybe even 40 through to kind of make up for any applicants that don't make it through poly or psych or backgrounds or even medical. Or to the chief's interview. If the chief or the sheriff says, nope, this person doesn't seem like a good fit, they can make that call. So that's one avenue. That's another avenue that they can use to evaluate candidates. And then you can kind of piece it together a little bit. You could use all those scores in the past to evaluate a candidate at the end of their board interview and say, hey, let's give this candidate some extra points. Veterans tend to get preference points for hiring if you're going to put them on a total packaging point sometimes. Not all departments. Well, maybe all departments do it. A lot of departments I've ran into do veteran preference, but not all the time, and that doesn't mean that it's only veterans that are going to get hired. So the one aspect that I would say here is those are the two main that I see, the collective score and then the individual scores moving through each phase. Now, once you get into the background, poly, psych, med, pretty much that whole background, scores aren't really tracked unless you had too many people make it through the entire hiring process. If you've had, then they're going to go through, reevaluate the candidate's entire application process, right, entire hiring process packet, and go through and pick out their top candidates if they have multiple make it through. But a lot of times what they'll do is if you make it into the background phase, it's a free-for-all. They're going to take the first people that make it through unless they have desired candidates and they're running on a structured rank schedule. I see a lot of candidates reach out and say, hey, I'm ranked number 1. That's great, getting all the way up to the board interview or getting into that background, that real assessment phase that you're going to have to do. But a lot of times that doesn't mean anything, because I shouldn't say it doesn't mean anything. You did really well and you worked really hard for it. But when you get into that background phase, if your paperwork is lagging or you don't have everything or you're delayed at scheduling other appointments that they required to, you're going to run into an issue where other people are going to get hired first. And it's not necessarily an issue as long as you're still in that top 25. But if you could be the most stellar candidate. But as they get candidates that come through and get cleared, they're going to hire them and they're going to give them official offers for this one purpose right now that we're seeing across the hiring practice. They don't want another department. Chances are that you and other candidates have applied to other departments. They don't want another department making that candidate a final offer before them, which is why departments have even started doing pre-hire a month or two before the academy starts. So there's a lot that goes into this, but ultimately that's how you want to look at it. Is you don't want to just settle when you say, oh, I'm ranked number 1 or I scored really well on that. Yes, it makes you a good candidate, and yes, they will evaluate that and consider that. But once you get into that background phase, you need to be prepared. You need to be able to move as quickly as possible without making a mistake so that it doesn't jam you up later. But yeah, there's a couple different ranking structures, and then there's a hybrid of the two, and then you have hiring pool agencies, which I can get into that another time later, where a hiring pool agency will actually rank the candidate, put them on the list, and then say, hey, when we have an open billet, you're the 1st or 10th or 14th or 20th on the list that we'll be reaching out to. I don't recommend applying to hiring pool agencies because you could be waiting a really long time to go through their hiring process. Hope this helps. Remember, those gifts are in the description, the Getting Started workshop, plus the coaching call with any member of the staff or even myself. Stay safe, and I will see you next time.